I'm very happy to have with us three great speakers to discuss this topic today. And I'll begin by introducing them in the order which they will present. Noura Arakat is a Palestinian human rights attorney and activist, and she's currently an adjunct professor of international human rights law in the Middle East at Georgetown University. Khalid, who's seated to her left, Khalid El-Gindi is a visiting fellow at the Sabin Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution, and he'll be able to provide an important perspective as he was part of the negotiating team from some of the years which were most heavily focused on during the presentation of the Palestine papers. And seated next to me, Mark Perry is a journalist and author, a frequent commentator on this issue, and he's the former co-director of the Washington, D.C., London, and Beirut-based Conflicts Forum. Before I turn it over to Noura to begin, I'd just like to remind you all to turn off anything you have that makes noise, put it in silent, so we could give our undivided attention to our speakers today, and to save your questions for the end, at which point we'd be happy to accommodate as many as we can. Noura?
Thank you, Yusuf, and to the Palestine Center and to all of you here today. I'm grateful to participate in this critical discussion alongside my esteemed colleagues. In the growing shadows of revolution in Egypt, an intransigent despotic regime sulks in the corners of their palaces for fears of the worst to come onto their doorsteps throughout the Arab world. For this reason, I have decided to explore Al Jazeera's Palestine papers in the context of revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia and its implications for an internecine uprising among the Palestinian national body in the occupied Palestinian territory, the citizens of Israel, and the communities living throughout global exile. Already, we've witnessed diasporic Palestinians in the U.S. issue a petition calling for the resignation of the entire Palestinian Authority. The London Palestinian students, representing the General Union of Palestinian Students, or GUPS, occupied the Palestinian embassy and demanded to be given a vote in the Palestinian National Council elections. Haneen Zughbi, a Palestinian Israeli Knesset member representing the Balad Party, published an open letter to the PA chastising them, or it, for making unauthorized decisions on behalf of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And within the territories, both in the West Bank and Gaza, Palestinians gathered in protest to demand the end of Oslo as they were demonstrating in solidarity with their Egyptian brothers and sisters. One of Tahrir Square's many lessons is that the Palestinian Authority has solidified itself as a version of broader anti-democratic structure. In an eerie echo of the Mubarak regime, plainclothes police forcefully infiltrated, punched, kicked, and detained participants in the protests in solidarity with Egyptians, as well as the protests demanding an end to Oslo a few weeks ago. This confirms what we already know. Since Oslo, a self-ordained leadership has worked not simply to negotiate the rights of a global Palestinian national body without accountability, but to steadily eviscerate the Palestine of post- and anti-colonial resistance movements in the folds of a not-so-new Middle East. The U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003 and its subsequent support of Israel's 2006 onslaught of Lebanon were the devastating markers of the Bush administration's reconfigured new Middle East. The Fatah-dominated Palestinian Authority has neatly fit within the U.S. camp, and this now fully configured configuration situates U.S. allies, including Egypt, or we're yet to see what will happen with Egypt, but Egypt so far, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon's March 14th coalition, and Fatah at odds with Iran, Syria, Hamas, and Hezbollah. Accordingly, the Mubarak regime and the PA have worked in lockstep to cater to U.S. prerogatives, earning them, along with Jordan, the moniker of Israel's strategic allies in the Middle East. The PA's policies have included colluding with the U.S. and Israel to target Hamas at the expense of the 1.5 million Palestinians in Gaza. Mubarak's regime has been part and parcel of Israel's debilitating blockade regime by sealing the Rafah border, while the PA turned a blind eye to Israel's atrocities against Gazans during its 22-day aerial and ground offensive Operation Cast Lead. The Mubarak regime has taken on Fatah's power struggle with Hamas as its own, given the latter's ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, long deemed a threat to domestic order. The Brotherhood and Hamas represent both domestic opposition and the regional discontent with a status quo that guards the interests of an exclusive and an intransigent political elite. The fortitude of the Mubarak-Abbas alliance is also the result of profound and vested investment in maintaining U.S. hegemony in the Middle East. The ouster of Mubarak has the potential to tip the balance and have broad ramifications, as we will see in the coming days, and as we've already seen in Palestine, where the PA's thwarting of solidarity protests exposes its fear that a people's revolution first courageously realized by the Tunisian people will spill into the occupied territories. Abbas's presidential mandate has long expired, and notwithstanding external support, so too has the PA's legitimacy. If anything, what Abbas and the PA have successfully orchestrated is the consolidation of their political structure as an accomplice of empire. The Palestine Papers seem for many to have added flame to this incendiary formulation. For those following the Oslo process, the Palestine Papers were not news. We have long known that the PA is more than willing to accept a land swap, to effectively abandon the right of return of Palestinian refugees, and to accept a demilitarized state and a truncated East Jerusalem in the midst of a territorial archipelago of mutually exclusive Bantustans. The PA has declared these positions as necessary concessions and a pragmatic approach to conflict resolution. Even if the documents are all false, or all misconstrued, as the leadership has claimed in response to Al Jazeera, the fact remains that the PA has led all Palestinians on a diplomatic track for nearly 2 decades that has proven deleterious to all Palestinian rights. Settlements have more than doubled. Jerusalem's Palestinian population is undergoing a rapid ethnic cleansing. Gaza's population suffers from a devastating blockade and still lacks rehabilitation after a grotesque onslaught in the winter 2008 and 9. The apartheid wall has encompassed illegal settlements and confiscated more Palestinian homes, all under the auspices of a peace process that affords Israel the status of partner and presents a false parity between an occupying and an apartheid power and an occupied nation. In fairness, the Palestine Papers have been significant among the Palestinian diaspora, which was appalled to the extent to which the negotiations team was theoretically willing to compromise, as well as the weakness of its position vis-a-vis the U.S. and its complicity with that position. However, well before Al Jazeera's investigation story of the year broke, the Palestinian national body globally had begun to respond to an undemocratic and unrepresentative government. This has happened in at least 2 demonstrable ways. First, the Palestinian national body has informally and on an ad hoc basis organized itself to respond to the PA's non-representative abrogations of its rights. And second, more formally, the diaspora community has tried to organize itself in national and international networks in order to insert themselves into a process from which they have been deliberately excluded. Consider a referendum in the fall of 2010. Then President Mahmoud Abbas rescinded the Goldstone Report. Internationally, the Palestinian diaspora community organized itself to demand his resignation, demonstrating that Abbas is accountable to them as members of his national constituency, relevant notwithstanding their exclusion from presidential and legislative elections. The PLO subsequently returned Goldstone for consideration at the Human Rights Council. I'm happy to comment about what that process looks like in Geneva. Second, in 2005, a broad swath of Palestinian civil society organizations issued a call to solidarity activists for the boycott, divestment, and sanction of Israel until it comports with international law and human rights norms regarding Palestinian refugees, those under occupation, as well as the citizens of Israel. In so doing, they both supplanted a status-based approach with a rights-based one, and reimagine Palestinians as a cohesive and global national body, and not just as those living under occupation, as the PA's territorial jurisdiction implies. In 2006, a cross-section of the U.S.-based Palestinian diaspora community founded the U.S.-Palestinian Community Network specifically to, quote, empower their community, unify their voice, and affirm the right of Palestinians in shaping their joint destiny. In continuation of this practice, Palestinians globally, from Europe to Latin America, the Arab world, and the U.S. are now responding to the Palestine Papers, as well as the PA's frenzied response to revolution's contagion. Like the campaigns that began in Egypt, this campaign has also begun on Facebook, and it is calling for a revitalization of the Palestinian National Council, and specifically for the inclusion of all Palestinians, regardless of geographic location and circumstance, to participate in the election of its leadership in the upcoming presidential and legislative elections, which have just been announced. This is the most formal demand to participate in a transnational government since the collapse of the PLO and the transfer of the Palestinian government from without the homeland in exile to within it under occupation in 1993. Like the Egyptians, Palestinians are demanding to be counted. They constitute part of what Lamis Andoni has described as the revival of modern-day pan-Arabism that no longer simply demands the end of U.S. domination and Israeli foreign colonization, but also demands domestic and national accountability. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Noura. At this point, I want to turn to Khalid.
Thank you, Yusuf. What I'd like to do is not necessarily stake out a position with or for or against any particular party, but maybe just to provide some context about the Palestine Papers, and as someone who was involved in the process for a number of years. For those of you who don't know, I worked for the Negotiation Support Unit from 2004 to 2009, which, as Yusuf said, was a period that was covered substantially in the documents that were released. So by way of context, I think it's important to remember that the documents that were released represent a small fraction of the universe of documents that exist on the peace process in general that were produced internally by Palestinian negotiators and advisors over the past decade or so. If I had to estimate, I would say they probably constitute about 10% of the universe of documents. So it's important to keep in mind that it's a useful but limited snapshot of what actually took place. The other point that I would make is that while the Palestine Papers, I think, clearly raise some very serious concerns about Palestinian negotiating behavior, I think it's important to point out that some of the reporting, and this is a key distinction, I think, between the way the Palestine Papers were handled and, let's say, WikiLeaks. Some of the reporting around the papers, I think, was characterized by, in some cases, inaccuracies. I think some of the reporting was hyped and sensationalized. I don't think there's anything earth-shattering in noting that, and also that, again, because this is a small picture of what actually took place, the factual and contextual, I suppose, well, I guess the factual context was incomplete. Some of it was also misleading and misinterpreted, and in some cases factually incorrect. So I just want to give a few examples. And again, I'm not sort of falling on the side of either my former colleagues or anybody who's reporting on it, but I think it's important to clarify what did and what did not happen. One thing that I heard repeatedly was the allegation, for example, that Sheikh Jarrah, Palestinians had given away Sheikh Jarrah as well as other parts of Jerusalem. This is inaccurate. Sheikh Jarrah was never on the negotiating table. I can say that with a fair amount of authority. There were comments that were made by Ahmed Qreya Abu Ala that were clearly taken out of context. The issue of the land swap, I thought, was reported in a way that was a little bit over the top in terms of being over-sensationalized. There was, in watching this sort of very dramatic re-dramatizations and actors and blurred, faces and things, it was, I thought, a little bit over the top. The land swap issue was one that obviously, it's part of a broader package, but there were also a number of kind of factual inaccuracies that were presented. For example, I heard the presenter on Al Jazeera repeatedly reference, all of this undeveloped land is being swapped, or this land in Jerusalem is being swapped for undeveloped land in Israel, including an area in the north, just north of the West Bank, called Bisan, that was actually criticized by the presenter on Al Jazeera as somehow lacking in value, when in actuality that area is extraordinarily rich agricultural land, and was intended to be as compensation for some of the rich agricultural land that would be taken from the Palestinian side. So I don't want to split hairs, but I think it's important to not necessarily accept the narrative as a whole. I would encourage people to read the documents for themselves now that they're in the public domain, and decide for themselves. Having said that, getting that out of the way, I think I would agree with most people that I think the Palestinian leadership did not handle the crisis well. I think their initial denial or their allegations that they were somehow fabricated clearly hurt them. I think undercut their credibility even further. But at the same time, I think for the most part, the Palestine papers confirmed what we already knew about the peace process and the key actors, not just the PLO, but also the United States and Israel. As far as the PA and the PLO are concerned, in addition to not handling the crisis well, in addition to having very limited sort of field of view in how they approach the negotiations, which is something that many of us as advisors often raised with the leadership. There is also, I think, at least a seriousness that was conveyed about the negotiations. Unlike, I think, either the Israelis or the Americans in the same process. And there's a willingness, obviously, to make very far-reaching concessions. But underlying that seriousness, I think if you look at the documents, you'll see, beyond territory and beyond sort of the many of the emotional issues, there was a real serious handling of a lot of technical issues ranging from electromagnetic spectrum to telecommunications to water that may or may not be conveyed in these documents. But I think it's important that people understand that at least from our standpoint, people were doing their best to try and protect Palestinian rights within this limited framework that was set up called the peace process or called the negotiations. I think we also saw coming out of these papers that Israel was repeatedly very not forthcoming and in some cases intransigent. I mean, I remember my own experiences on the Territory Committee. We had a total of 8 meetings at the technical level with our Israeli counterparts, and we spent probably the first 4 or 5 of those meetings just talking about 1967. Of course, we were insisting that it's the only basis for discussion, and the Israelis saying there's no such thing as 1967. So that you get a real sense, I think, if you look at the documents, you get a sense for the lack of seriousness, I think, on the Israeli side. On the American side, again, whether it's the Bush administration or the Obama administration, you get a sense that, once again, the Americans are involved in a process where they have their thumb squarely on the scale. on Israel's side. And you see that, for example, in Condoleezza Rice's insistence that no Israeli government would ever accept a map that didn't include Israel's annexation of Ma'ale Adumim and Ariel, which were two, among other settlement areas that were red lines for the Palestinians. So to have the Americans weighing in on that, I think also was very telling. And if you look even deeper in the documents, you see that non-U.S. third-party roles like the EU and the Quartet were ultimately non-actors in this process for all the, again, not much by way of surprise. With all of that said, I think the Palestine Papers clearly had very serious ramifications for the Palestinian leadership. Again, I think they did not handle the crisis well. We've seen the resignation of Saeb Erekat and the likely disbanding of the negotiation support unit. I think clearly their credibility has been eroded, particularly with regard to any future negotiations, and I think they've been victims of their own lack of creativity, to put it mildly. And I also think that one of the major implications has been to further set back chances for internal reconciliation. And so while I agree with Noura about the need to incorporate the diaspora and other heretofore voiceless Palestinian constituencies, I'm not convinced that this actually furthers that. In fact, I think it makes it much more difficult going forward. So, just to sort of cap off with what I see as some lessons or some takeaways and maybe some ideas on the way forward, I think both the papers and Egypt have shattered previous assumptions about the Middle East and about this phenomenon known as the peace process. One thing that I've been trying to emphasize in both my writing and in meeting with administration officials is that legitimacy does in fact matter. I mean, we've seen obviously in Tunisia and then in Egypt and now in other Arab countries and Iran, that how responsive a government is to its constituency clearly matters, and that's something that Washington has never really paid attention to, and I think, at least is my hope, that they'll begin to pay attention to that. And so what I think that means in the Palestinian context is that the United States and the international community have to not necessarily push for reconciliation, but they have to certainly allow for a natural Palestinian politics to take place with all Palestinian constituencies, both inside and outside Palestine, and in whatever form that takes. We can, if people have specific questions, we can throw around some concrete ideas. But I think as a principle, Palestinians, like Egyptians and others, have to be allowed to engage in their politics. Otherwise, a very narrow, non-representative clique may end up harming the broader goal. We also learned that the old binary of it's either the autocratic regimes or the Islamists, I think that's also been shattered as a myth. And again, this relates to the idea that all Palestinian factions and Palestinian groups, whether they're inside or outside Palestine, need to be included in any future political process claiming to represent Palestinians. And just sort of to state the obvious, the old way of conducting the peace process clearly hasn't worked. And one sort of eye-opening note in that regard is that the Obama administration, for all of its promise, and I think a lot of us were optimistic 2 years ago, I think has behaved in almost identical fashion to both of its predecessors, and arguably in some cases worse. So with that, I'll end and look forward to your questions.
Thank you for coming. I had a big, long speech, and forget it. When I'm really tired of the Middle East and dealing with the Middle East, and the last 2 weeks for all of us have been, I turn to science fiction as an escape. And last night, I realized I couldn't do that anymore. During the Second Intifada, I picked up a book by Dan Simmons called Endymion, which takes place 50,000 years in the future. Its protagonist is a Palestinian. The one thing he really wants is a Palestinian state. Listen, the issue here has turned from the Palestine Papers into Al Jazeera's coverage of the Palestine Papers. That's what's happened over the last 4 weeks, and it's unfortunate. And a little bit of transparency, I was part of the expert group called by Al Jazeera to Doha to take a look at these papers, and was there for 10 days going through them. And there was quite a debate, actually, in Al Jazeera about the impact of the papers, what would be our focus, what the focus of the network should be, what the papers said. And I get the impression sometimes in the wake of the publication of the papers that people are like, wow, this was a hit job by Al Jazeera. There's another agenda here. There's suspicious links to the CIA. And that's it's just not true. There was a debate. I participated in the debate. I think sometimes I inadvertently caused the debate, because when I was given the papers without any kind of introduction, without any kind of prejudice, without any kind of here's what we want to do. Mark, take a look at them. Tell us what they say, which I think is a very honest process. And I focused immediately. It's almost like a magnet. You know, it's like reading the name George Mitchell in the paper. I immediately focus on an American, not a Palestinian. I focus on what the United States is doing or not doing. And so I immediately focused on the period of September and October of 2009 and the importance of those documents. Other people focused on other things. Robert Grenier focused on intelligence and security. He's a former CIA officer. Ali Abu Nema focused on the right of return. He's a Palestinian. Clayton Swisher focused on the PA. I focused on George Mitchell. So my argument coming to the table with Al Jazeera was, the story here is not ERICOT, right of return, PA. It's the Americans. Because the documents I read, there are 1,600 of them. The documents I read that I think are the key to this story are September and October 2009. I urge you all to read them. They are as follows: February 27, 2009, October 2, 2009, September 24, 2009, October 20, 2009, and 2 documents of October 21 of 2009. 6 documents in all. If you want to find out what the American position is on the peace process, read those documents. And here's what you'll find. That after years and years and years of talking about the roadmap, phase 1 of the roadmap, which is in exchange for an end to Palestinian violence, Israel will free settlements. And on the roadmap, the Obama administration abandons the position of successive administrations and allows settlement building. And when Saab Erekat says, wait a second, how can you do this? George Mitchell says, it's not an international agreement, it's not legally binding, that's the way it is, take it or leave it. So, for me, in Doha, I said, and I admire George Mitchell, but it's right there in black and white. And I find him to be a credible mediator. He has Northern Ireland behind him, right? This guy's not an amateur. I think he's a principled guy. He has a mandate from the President of the United States, and he says, forget the roadmap. It's out the window. Which means, we're going to allow Israel to continue to build settlements, which makes a 2-state solution recede ever further from possibility. And sows discord among the Palestinian population. Why are we allowing it? Because we can't stand up to Israel. That's the only reason. And it's clear from the papers. So don't forget the fabrication. The papers were stolen, the CIA's, it's baloney. Read the papers. And read those 6 documents that I pointed out, September, October 2009. Just go on Al Jazeera and type in George Mitchell, September 2009, October 2, and you'll read them. And you Americans in the audience will be embarrassed by your own government. Now, I have a few minutes, right? What are we going to do? I mean, we've had between the Palestine Papers and now the Egyptian Revolution. And if it wasn't clear from the Palestine Papers, it ought to be clear now that the 3 pillars of our policy in the United States are slowly being washed away. They are support for Israel, no matter what. Opposition to Iran, and no talking with political Islam. So when you see the statement in the press, we had no idea this was coming. Who could have predicted the Egyptian Revolution? The reason, where did this come from? Hosni Mubarak didn't tell us it was going to happen, because that's who we talk to in the Middle East. We talk to the regimes we support, and we called the Egyptian regime moderate. Because they signed the Camp David Accord. Because they won't talk to political Islam, because they talk to Iran. This is not a moderate regime. This was a police state, and we supported it. We are now going to have to, in Egypt, recognize, regardless of what Hillary said yesterday about hijacking the revolution, what she means is the Muslim Brotherhood's there. Regardless of all of that rhetoric, we're going to have to deal with the governments that emerge from what I think is an unstoppable revolution across the region, and that means talking to political Islam. We're not going to be able to not talk to Hamas after we talk to the Muslim Brotherhood. We're going to have to talk to them. So once we start down that road of recognizing the political currents and movements that matter in the region, everything else will follow. Our interest in the Middle East is separate from the interest of Israel. It's our security that's at risk. It's our credibility that's at risk. It's our legitimacy that's at risk. Then, once we take care of that, fine, we can take care of our allies. But our move to democracy, our support for democracy, our belief in democracy must come ahead of our principled support for Israel. It must. Or we're going to lose. So if there's a lesson that we can take away from the Palestine Papers, it's how the United States has, on the basis of those 3 principles, pushed the Palestinians to accept an imposed peace that is not in their interest, but not in Israel's interest. That will not work. When people tell you the Egyptian Revolution buried the peace process, you tell them it's been dead a long time. That's what I have to say.
Thank you. At this time, I'm going to pose a couple questions to the panel that I would hope we can get brief answers to, and in the meantime, those watching can send in their questions via Facebook or Twitter, and then we'll move to taking questions from the audience. I just want to put some numbers out there, because I feel that you know, in this discussion, a lot of sort of the substantive information has been missing. And there's been a lot of consistent polling of the Palestinian population on specific issues that were discussed in the Palestine Papers as concessions. And I just want to read to you some numbers here on specific issues, polling the population of the West Bank and Gaza and where they stand. In terms of final borders and territorial exchange, 50% oppose such concessions. On refugees, similar to the proposed concessions in the Clinton parameters, 57% oppose such a settlement. Mind you, this doesn't include the diaspora population. On Jerusalem, 63% oppose a compromise in which East Jerusalem would become the capital if it only included Arab neighborhoods and not Jewish ones. On a demilitarized Palestinian state, 74% oppose the establishment of a demilitarized Palestinian state, and so on and so forth. Even in the West Bank and in Gaza, where the Palestinian leadership that is engaged in these negotiations is located. There seems to be a disconnect between what was discussed behind closed doors and what people actually think on the ground about which concessions are acceptable and which concessions are absolutely not acceptable. How does that happen, and how can these negotiations go on for as long as they have with any expectation of success while such a big disconnect exists? And again, this is the West Bank and Gaza, not the rest of the Palestinian community, which has an interest in the outcome of this conflict. So I'd like to hear any thoughts that any of you have on that.
Well, I guess I'll start and say that part of the way that it happens is precisely what leads us to unaccountable governments and regimes. As we saw in the case of Egypt, and as you've discussed, we aren't talking to the constituencies themselves. Instead, we're providing for the leadership, and therefore that leadership is accountable to its patron. And in the same way, the PA, the Fatah-dominated PA, especially since 2007, since June 2007, when Hamas violently ousted Fatah from the Gaza Strip, at that point a new policy ensued whereby the support for the PA, not necessarily for Palestinians, but against Hamas, began to come from the US and from Israel and the EU. And you can trace it to well before that time, where legitimacy was from an external source as opposed to a domestic one. But at least since 2007, it's become explicit and undeniable that the PA henceforth was accountable to US prerogatives. And even those in the West Bank and Gaza, elections have been frozen. The presidential mandate has expired. You can decide that elections happen today or postpone them for another 6 months. There are no mechanisms of accountability to be able to respond to those unilateral decisions. And so, in a very reductionist way, it's precisely the lack of democratic institutions whereby leadership can get away with it.
My sense is that the reaction, the visceral reaction that people had to the Palestine Papers and these concessions that Palestinians were prepared to make, and this is intuitive and not sort of empirical based on, I don't have hard evidence. But my own sense is that had the Palestinians gone in with a genuine mandate, had the negotiators gone in with a genuine mandate on the part of the PLO, not the PAs, is not, the PA is not the negotiating body. The PA is an administrative instrument that administers. It's basically, essentially, a glorified municipality. But the PLO is a decision-making body, is what is legally entrusted to negotiate. Had the PLO gone in with a genuine mandate from its people, both inside and outside, and these concessions were on the table, I think the reaction would have been very different. In other words, it matters, the substance of an agreement or the concessions matter at least as much as the legitimacy of the people or the perceived legitimacy of the people who are making them. And I think that's a point that the American administration has not gotten. And so for me, it's less of an issue that 1.9% here, clearly, I don't want to make this sort of a sweeping statement across the board, because I think there are moral and legal problems with, for example, the way they handled the refugee issue, not to mention political problems. But if you look at territory, or if you look at Jerusalem, some of the proposals that were being discussed, or what Palestinians were prepared to accept, their sort of red line, I think a majority of Palestinians, probably inside and outside, would be willing to go along with those concessions had they been negotiated by people that they perceived to be legitimate. And I think the fact that there was this, even before the Palestine Papers, that these negotiators were going into negotiations with an internal split within Palestine, not to mention a sort of a divorce having taken place with the diaspora and the refugees in particular. The fact that they were going into these negotiations without that necessarily, it doomed it from the start. And that's my own view. It's not something I can prove kind of empirically, but I think it holds true because a lot of these same things were discussed 10 years ago at Camp David, and so they weren't new. I mean, there was the sort of people were outraged at 1.9%, but nobody was that outraged at the 9% that Barack was talking about, or 12%. I mean, they were outraged, but anyway, I think that's an important point.
I agree. I think you should have election in the West Bank and Gaza that elects a new Palestinian leadership that will have, by stint of the election, legitimacy. But I think that I would add one thing. If you walk down the streets of Ramallah, which I do from time to time, you stop anyone and says, what is your government's position on the peace negotiations? What's their position? They'll say, I don't have a clue. And I've always advocated the Palestinian leadership, say what your goals are. Tell your people what your goals are. So, it's not a surprise when you come in with positions that are going to, it's not a surprise when you're going to come in with positions that surprise them. And by the way, 57% of the American people believe that we shouldn't have any kind of nuclear weapons treaties with Russia. But we do anyway. This is why we have democracy, so we can ignore the polls. Well, you elect a leadership, they act on your behalf, that's it. Then have a referendum. You can have a referendum. Palestinians have called for a referendum on any peace negotiation. I agree with it.
Okay, I'm going to forego my second question in the interest of time, and can we just see a show of hands of questions? If you just wait for a moment till we get the microphone, we'll start right up here in the front. If you could please just let us know who you're addressing the question to.
Is there a consensus among Palestinians, those who live in the occupied territories and in the diaspora, that there must be a majority vote or near consensus among all Palestinians on any decisions that will be made about a Palestinian state, the refugee issue, and other final status issues? If so, what mechanism could there be that would determine the views of the diaspora Palestinians? Or, as Mark is suggesting, if there were honest elections in the occupied territories, would that serve and give a mandate of the elected leadership there to do what they thought should be done?
I thought you were going to take more questions. So this is an excellent question, and sadly, it's the question that should have been asked first. Is how do we pool our diaspora population? How do we remain representative of the PLO? The PLO in its charter asserts that it is the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. People as defined in international law as those who are entitled to self-determination includes those people outside the bounds of a state but in the diaspora. And so this brings us back to the question, and you raised it, the distinction between the PLO and the PA. And if you noticed in my discussion, I collapsed the two precisely because they've been collapsed. Hamas has never been a member of the PLO. The PLO has become defunct, especially since 1993. Whereas before, when it was in diaspora, it was therefore focused on quarreling diaspora voices, and especially the leadership of refugees. Once it transferred to the territory, specifically to Gaza and now to Ramallah, that shift in government representation marks the exclusion of those Palestinians, and there has been no mechanism to be able to incorporate them. Now, there have been informal approaches to this, like the U.S. Palestinian Community Network or the USPCN, as well as the Palestine Youth Network, which is an international network of youth aged 18 to 35 to organize themselves. Palestinians on their own are creating these mechanisms, but there has been no sincere resuscitation of the PLO or of the PNC, which might provide positive models, but we also have other models we can look to, especially amongst absentee voting, like has happened in the case of Iraqi citizens who are not in Iraq but were able to participate in the election of their government when democratic elections were possible after invasion, as well as the Tamils who from Sri Lanka who were able to also organize themselves in diaspora to have elections. We have models. The question isn't a lack of options because the models don't exist, it's a will. And that's precisely what we should be looking at. And I really appreciate what Khalid said. This will is now leveraged. The Palestinian leadership now must have more of this will because the cost of ignoring it in the aftermath of Tunis and Egypt is much higher.
In the interest of time, because we have a number of hands, I want to take 3 questions at a time. So, Henny, why don't you start back there? And if you could just keep your question brief and let us know who you're posing it to, we'd appreciate that. Right there.
Hi, just to piggyback on what you were just talking about the people in the diaspora, the Palestinians in the diaspora, how can we manage to have any say in the diaspora when it's the Israelis who get to decide right now who what constitutes a Palestinian citizen? There are plenty of people, not just the refugees from Israel proper, but many people who are from the occupied territories who are no longer in Palestine for a wide variety of reasons, and they can't be considered citizens unless the Israelis give that the go-ahead.
Thank you. Right here, Henny.
I'm Dr. Said, a retired surgeon.
Just one moment, wait for the microphone. Sorry.
I'm Dr. Said, a retired surgeon. This is addressed to Nora. If what you're advocating is really fulfilled, is there a possibility that Hamas takes over the West Bank, and so we have Hamas in the West Bank, in Gaza, and add to this a possibility of Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt? Is this a good scenario for the Palestinian problem?
You go over on this side as well.
Under normal conditions in European countries, any scandal that takes place immediately sees the resignation of the whole cabinet, if not the minister himself. I don't know, maybe I'm out of date. Did anybody resign from this group? Yes. Not all of them, one of them maybe.
No, they're all always.
I mean, Berlusconi is probably going to resign for a sex scandal.
Yeah. So we've got 3 questions. Anyone want to start taking a stab at these?
I'll take Berlusconi.
Are you qualified?
Okay. So I want to address 2 questions, and one is about Israel gets to define who is a Palestinian, who's not. That's actually not true. Palestinians can self-define who are Palestinians, and this question is not subject to either a one-drop rule or alternatively being a 3/4 as the U.S. has imposed upon Native Americans or African Americans.
I'm also talking about the ability of right of return of people, even whose families or who directly come from the occupied territory. For example, somebody like me can only go for 3 months at a time. The inability to
Right, so but these are different questions. These are about Israel's control of the borders and how do we combat that. So let me just quickly, the idea of who is Palestinian and who gets to participate comes down to self-definition. How then we exert pressure upon making the borders something that we control as a national body, as part of our self-determination, is precisely this question of strategy and precisely the critique of Oslo and negotiations, because Oslo and negotiations at the exclusion of other mechanisms based on law and human rights, like the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, like the lawsuits against Israeli generals as they travel throughout Europe for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and even here in the United States, like what's more broadly known as what has been termed the delegitimization campaign, and what AIPAC's president has termed the second largest threat to Israel after Iranian nuclear weapons. Those campaigns and that work has been done by those Palestinians who do want a stake to determine whether or not they are part of a polity and to determine the outcome of what happens on the ground. As to this question about do I think it's going to be a good outcome? Well, first, I'd like to have a vote. And if I had a vote, not living in the territories, because my father never kept his papers, if I had a vote, then I would not vote for Hamas. I would vote against Hamas. I would not vote for Fatah. I would not want either of them. I'd like a lot of choices, and there is a lot of leadership and vibrant leadership on the ground. Our fixation on the threat of the Muslim Brotherhood, the threat of Hamas, is completely contradictory with any commitment to democratic tenets. It's as if we have a conditional acceptance of democracy. And it's the constant question in the midst of the most heroic revolution in the Arab world, amongst the largest Arab country, commentators were asking, what if this becomes Iran 1979? It doesn't matter, because you forget about an Iran 1953 and about the threat of external intervention and how that harms populations for decades upon decades. And so my answer to your question is, no, I don't think it would be a good idea, and if I was able to vote, I wouldn't vote for them.
Next time, do like that. Don't vote to us. Give us the question you have.
I had a short time.
On this issue of the PLO versus the PA, my own personal view is that the fatal mistake that was made during the Oslo process, because of the Oslo process, was shifting the power from the PLO, this collapsing of the PLO and the PA, and that necessarily excluded the diaspora, which of course is something that Israelis have been pushing for a long time, and that the Americans were all too happy to see happen as well. And this kind of conflating of the PLO with the PA has been a real problem. My view is I'm actually not for elections, because I think logistically it becomes hard to hold elections outside of the West Bank and Gaza, and probably even in Gaza or outside of the West Bank. I think elections are flawed, and we've seen the flaw. I think holding elections under occupation is probably not a good idea. I think that instead of holding an election, there will be time for elections after independence at some point. But having said that, there has to be some way to legitimize a new Palestinian leadership. That can come through elections. It can come through congresses of some sort. There has to be. It has to be all-inclusive. We're seeing this dynamic happen in Egypt. There's not going to be an election tomorrow that's going to decide on the constitution and decide on the form of government and decide on all these things. There have to be shortcuts taken, unfortunately. And I think the most important thing is essentially to do is to put the PA back into its administrative place and reconstitute or reform the PLO, and that means to make it inclusive. And then through that, whatever the consensus is within this new Palestinian movement, that becomes the direction, whether they pursue negotiations or they pursue other means, diplomatic or otherwise. That becomes part of the Palestinian politics that I think needs to happen. So I don't think the focus is necessarily on elections, unless you could somehow ensure that the diaspora would be included. And I see that logistically as very difficult, and politically, because they'd be voting in countries like Lebanon and Jordan, where it would be seen as a threat.
I want to take one more round of questions, and we'll do 4 more because we are limited in time. Let's start with the young man right here, and we'll go across the room after that. Just wait for the microphone 1 second.
Thank you. My question is, legally speaking, in legal terms, what's the status of the Palestinian Authority? Because it was established after the Oslo Accord between the Palestine Liberation Organization and the government of Israel that allowed for an interim period of 5 or 6 years that expired in September 1999. So is the PA still valid entity or not in legal terms?
In the back there, Henny. So
I'll have it for a moment. Very quick.
Very brief.
On the advice that you would give to President Obama and Senator Mitchell, what would be the 3 points that you think they should make at this point? Any one of them. All of them.
Go right in the back.
Josh Rubner from the U.S. Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation. Question for Mark. The statements you mentioned attributed to George Mitchell coincide with President Obama's big climb down on the issue of settlements at the GA in September 2009. My question for you is, looking through the Palestine papers, was there any indication that the Obama administration's formerly much stronger statements against Israeli settlements were just for public consumption, or was that also part of the negotiating strategy? Or was Mitchell undermining Obama and Clinton's very strong statements against settlements prior to that time?
Okay, right here. If you could just keep your right there, Henny. Yeah, in the back row. Just
Tyke Berry, Code Pink. I'd like to ask, even though I agree with what you were talking about, and I'm about the elections, I'd just like to ask, why do you think at this moment that Abu Mazen is calling for elections when last year or a year and a half ago they refused to go to elections? And is it because have anything to do with Hamas saying they're not going to participate, or why did they ask at this point?
And then, hey, this will be our last question here, and then I'll repeat them all so we can try to respond to them.
There was a beautifully poignant letter in the New York Times at the end of Clinton administration where the negotiators, I assume some of the same people, said this is pointless. The process is peace for Israel, and we're negotiating away our rights, and it's going nowhere. I'm sort of surprised that it ever continued, and why, it seems very hopeful that everyone's resigned and we can just go to international law and stop appealing to Israel and America to give rights that they're asking you to negotiate away.
And I'm just going to add a question that came in via Facebook, and then we can try to respond all of them. From Jenna Najjar, the question is to Noura: what actual steps can be taken to overhaul the PA and get all Palestinians inside and outside of the territories represented? What's the strategy now, and what are the political legal options available? So there's a lot to respond to there, and I'm just going to recap them. Whether or not the PA is a legal entity now, what 3 points would you give to the U.S. and George Mitchell? Why is Abu Mazen calling for elections? What Mitchell's strategy was that Josh mentioned? Anyone like to start responding to all of that?
Okay. So just a few things. On the PA's legitimacy, let's go back. The PA was a creation of the Oslo Accords, and therefore, so long as the negotiations take place, technically, they are a legal entity. When the PLO dissolves it, then it will no longer be legal. It's a different question to ask whether or not the PA's constitution as it exists today is legal, and that we can say it is not because of the expiration of the presidential mandate and the legislative mandate. In 2009, it was extended by a year, and so it continued through 2010. We are now in 2011. It is officially expired. So that is what we know about the PA. So which brings, and let's just an interesting note, that since 1993, since the advent of the peace process, the discussion of Palestinians has constantly and consistently been that Israel has no partner for peace. The only moment where that shifted, and shifted demonstrably, and now has become the status quo, is in the aftermath of June 2007, when Mahmoud Abbas became the partner for peace, the preferable moderate representative. And that's well noted in all congressional records and so on and so forth. And so this brings it back. So if the PA's mandate has expired, how can it continue to exist? Because it's being supported externally. And so it brings the woman who asked the question, what can be done? The first thing that needs to be done is that those in the diaspora and Palestinians themselves need to be much more organized. And there's glimpses of that, and I've mentioned the U.S. Palestinian Community Network. If you're listening and you're interested, you can check out PalestineConference.org, completely volunteer run. It's a diaspora network, but there's international networks as well. And so now, and other networks that are being created is a call on February 28th for international demonstrations by Palestinians, wherever they may be, to demand that they be included in elections. And this isn't necessarily just elections for the PA, which is administrative, but to be a part of a global whole. And I just want, last note, this is not to say that negotiations should be dismissed altogether. I support negotiations. I support a political process. But I don't support negotiations that are mutually exclusive with all other forms of pressure that are based on law and human rights norms, which would afford Palestinians leverage upon which to negotiate, similar to the way that the first Palestinian uprising, or Intifada in 1987, created a platform for the peace process to begin with. And so I would urge for a process that sees those as compatible.
Mark is going to jump in here. The Palestine papers show that it's not Israel that doesn't have a partner for peace. It's the Palestinians that don't have a partner for peace. That's what the Palestine papers show, to bring it back to the subject. Three things. A disunited Palestinian polity cannot negotiate legitimately with Israel for peace. Reconciliation is the key. The Palestinians have to have a strong side of the table, or they're not going to win. So reconciliation is what we can do, stop standing in the way of it. Now that we have a change of government, we hope, in Egypt, that obstacle will be gone, we hope. Secondly, the United States needs to lay out its position on peace, something that the Obama administration has failed to do. What do we expect, and when do we expect it? And I want to correct President Obama needs to make it clear. The Palestinians are not fighting for their rights. They have their rights. Those rights are inalienable. They cannot be negotiated away. They're fighting for their independence. Obama's got to stop talking about Palestinian rights and start talking about a Palestinian state. This isn't Birmingham. These people are under occupation. There was no hint in the Palestinian papers that the United States was ever anything but absolutely serious about a settlement freeze. But when it became clear that that wasn't going to happen, it's amazing when you read the Palestine papers from the 6 document dates that I've given you, how quickly the roadmap was abandoned because they couldn't get that freeze. That's the answer.
But on that point, the roadmap was abandoned long before Senator Mitchell was appointed to his position. I think the roadmap was published April 23rd, 2003, and I think it was abandoned April 24th, 2003. And it was simultaneously, it was put out there as a bone, essentially, to the international community and to some extent to the Palestinians. The quartet was a way to sort of mollify all these international actors who wanted to be at the table, and the roadmap was a nice little document and a cheap way to do that.
Every time I told the administration to talk to Hamas, they said, when they meet the roadmap conditions.
Right.
Every time I told time I told them a settlement freeze, they said, yeah,
That's
absolutely, that's in the roadmap conditions. Maybe they abandoned it on the 24th, the day after. I'm not disagreeing with you.
Yeah, and I don't mean that literally, by the way, but yeah.
But it was never clear to the Palestinians that it was a problem.
That's true. I think they always held out that the roadmap would somehow, was what the text said and not what Dove Weisglass and Condoleezza Rice decided it said, or what Obama and Mitchell decided it said. But on this issue of the legal status of the PA, I think it's not essentially a legal question. I think it's a political question. The PA is viewed, well, to be more precise, the PA in Ramallah, because there's another one in Gaza that also goes by the term PA, and they have their own prime minister, and they use the same emblems, in fact. The PA in Ramallah has been accepted internationally. It's been, I think probably if you poll most West Bankers, they'll probably say that's our legitimate government just simply by default. And so it's, I think the legal question is less relevant with regard to when it expired or I mean, people forget that Arafat was elected in, what, 95? 96,
96.
For a 5-year term, and he far surpassed that term. And nobody questioned whether, you know, the day after May 1999, nobody said, I don't think Yasser Arafat's the president of the PA anymore. And again, it's not because people are being hypocritical. I think it's because it's when there's already a perception of illegitimacy, then you sort of retroactively you find the legal or political justification to make that argument. And for better or for worse, I think all of these arguments, whether the president's term is legally expired or not, are not relevant. What matters is that there's a serious legitimacy problem within the government in Ramallah, and probably to some extent even in the government in Gaza, because they too suppressed demonstrations that were trying to show solidarity with the Egyptians. So there's a sense of, you know, the people are to be feared in both camps, and I think the only way out of that mess is in one form or another to have a unified Palestinian house, whatever shape that takes, the PLO, a new entity of some sort. I don't think that the path is negotiations. I think negotiations have shown time and time again that the Americans cannot be relied upon to implement even their own words, as we've seen on the roadmap and other policies and the upcoming vote at the Security Council. I think the only way out of this, the only way, and this is the reason, whoever asked, why is Abu Mazen going to elections? And I think the answer is simple: Egypt. Because like everyone else, he realizes that he has a legitimacy problem, and he's trying to shore that up. I don't happen to think that elections are the way to shore it up. I think to start a dialogue with Hamas and with other groups is probably the best way to shore up your legitimacy, and then an election can take place in due course. If that's what the consensus of the groups, the factions, then they can hold elections. But elections outside of the context of reconciliation, I think, are meaningless, just as negotiations outside of the context of reconciliation are not terribly meaningful.
Well, thank you all very much.